become modern-day Bridgeport. If the project itself had been more successful financially and better organized, there's no telling where the Irish would have moved after this. They could have gone out to Utah and dug ditches for the Mormons.
You'll get the point of order.
Bridgeport remains the spiritual center of Irish Chicago.
As long as I'm mayor, no one will be stepped on.
It was home to 5 20th century mayors.
And that goes for you, too.
In April 1848, the General Thornton, a canal boat from New Orleans, arrived in Chicago with a cargo of sugar and produce headed for Buffalo. Its arrival there was heralded in Washington by a young congressman from Illinois, Abraham Lincoln. Joliet had dreamed of a water route from the Gulf of Mexico to Montreal. It ended instead in New York. The Illinois and Michigan Canal spared migrants the bumpy trip by horse and wagon west to the prairies and brought their produce back to Chicago. The prospect of the canal had created Chicago, luring investors like William Butler Ogden. But by the time the canal opened in 1848, Ogden had switched his bet and built a railroad to the prairies.
Ogden found that Eastern financiers were not interested in the railroad. It seemed to have relatively limited prospects, and so he went out in his buggy along the prospective route and talked farmers into buying stock.
And they're knocking on farmers' doors and the doors of businessmen who own land on the route and saying, look, we're going to run a railroad through here, give us right-of-way, become an investor by giving us right-of-way, give us money, and we'll give you shares in our company.
Ogden raised $350,000 and bought a rickety locomotive, the Pioneer, which would run on wooden tracks with metal caps. On November 20th, 1848, the Pioneer chugged west for 8 miles to the end of the line. Along the way, it met a farmer with a wagon load of wheat. It became the first wheat brought by train to Chicago. On the next trip, farmers overwhelmed the train with 30 carloads. It was men like Ogden, who became the city's leading citizen as much as Chicago's location, that would make it the great city of the Midwest.
Any one of those small towns surrounding Chicago, out there on the rim of civilization, have equally propitious locations. But there's something about Chicago that triggers an economic revolution, where an economic revolution isn't triggered in a place like Kenosha. And it's hard to say exactly why, but there is this wonderful synergy, this combination of people of energy, risk takers, who come to that place. They see city building as a supremely human art, and they see that they have a chance here to turn this prairie bog into a great city.
To make Chicago attractive to newcomers, like himself, Ogden and the Eastern elite supported civic and cultural institutions, among them hospitals, orphanages, and the Chicago Historical Society. All on the north side of the river where they lived, not in Bridgeport where the Irish lived. Ogden raised money for new streets and wooden plank sidewalks. To accommodate canal traffic, he pushed for bridges, swing bridges, anchored in the middle of the river. The motivation was selfish as well as civic. Ogden could not forget, a friend remembered, that everything which benefited Chicago benefited him. The location of his city was suited for commerce, not for habitation. It was so wet in the spring that horses had to be dug out of mud pits. Signs read, "No bottom here," and "Shortest road to China." Scavenging pigs were the frontier city's answer to the garbage problem. This was 1848, the year of the canal and Ogden's Railroad, the year that Chicago began to use its strategic location to build a commercial empire that would change America. The year the young city opened its first important factory on the north side of the river. In 1831, Cyrus Hall McCormick, son of a Virginia farmer, had built a primitive reaper, overcoming problems that had plagued farmers for centuries, cutting grain by hand, one hand with a sickle, two with a scythe. He sensed the best market for his reaper would be farther west, on the vast wheat fields of Illinois.
Farmers would set in a wheat crop. That's no problem. The planting, it's the harvesting that's the problem. They're out there with their boys and their cousins and a couple of their neighbors cutting wheat with a sickle and a scythe. And they can't cut the wheat fast enough. And a lot of the wheat simply dies in the field. And McCormick, when he toured on foot the Midwest, saw this happening, saw farmers losing because they couldn't bring in the wheat fast enough. And here he sees a great chance.
The first year, McCormick made 450 reapers, none the same, each blade forged by hand. With 120 employees, he was Chicago's largest employer. But no one worked harder. There by the furnace fire, begrimed with coal and dust, decorated with an apron of leather, wrote the Chicago Daily Journal, stood the one in charge of it all, Cyrus Hall McCormick. The paper called the reaper a mechanical man. It freed farmers worldwide from their bondage to the sickle and scythe and helped open the Midwest. Chicago revolutionized not only the production of grain, but how it was transported and traded. Farmers who cut grain with McCormick's first reapers loaded their sacks onto wagons and headed off to a stream. There, the grain would be reloaded onto rafts and floated downriver until it reached the Mississippi.
Once these rafts have reached the Mississippi, all the grain is taken off in the sacks, loaded onto the shore of the river, and then they're carried once again into the holds of small boats that are on the upper Mississippi River, and there they are carried on down to St. Louis, where they're unloaded yet again, put out onto the levee in St. Louis, and then loaded yet again by hand on somebody's back, carried onto a larger steamship, which will carry it on down to New Orleans, where it's unloaded yet again, and put onto an ocean-going vessel to New York or to the North Atlantic economy and on to Europe. There's a huge amount of labor cost, and so this is a very expensive way to move grain.
The railroad overcame the constraints of geography. As plank roads had reached out to farmers a few miles, railroads from Chicago reached out hundreds of miles, cutting into the hinterland of St. Louis. In the decade after Ogden's Chicago and Galena Union headed out toward the Mississippi, New York investors financed railroads that spread out from Chicago like tentacles. By 1856, Chicago had become the railroad hub of America.
What made Chicago so special was that the web of railroads that were being projected west dumped everything into Chicago's lap. It became the funnel that delivered an entire ecosystem, the entire western landscape, into the waiting markets of the eastern seaboard of the United States and of Europe.
They seem so commonplace today, the picturesque hallmark of every rural town. But in the 19th century, the grain elevator was a revolutionary technology that transformed the handling of grain around the world and doomed the sack. Grain elevators were developed in Buffalo. Chicago built its first in 1848. By 1858, 12 mammoth grain houses dominated its skyline. When poet Carl Sandburg called Chicago a stacker of wheat, he was referring to grain elevators, the city's first skyscrapers. Grain flowed from the elevators into the holds of lake boats to be shipped east, where it was refined. What became a golden stream in Chicago still moved by sack on the backs of laborers in St. Louis. In the 1840s, it had taken an Irish crew all day to load a boat with 7,000 bushels of wheat. A decade later, the same amount could be loaded in an hour by one man. Six years after its canal, first railroad, and grain elevator, Chicago surpassed St. Louis in the grain trade. 10 years after McCormick built his factory, the Mississippi Valley was the world's largest food-producing region. Chicago became known as the Great Reaper City. Its port replaced Archangel and Odessa in Russia as the greatest grain port in the world. The Chicago River became a mammoth exchange engine. Ships heading east with grain from the west passed fleets carrying lumber from the north. Its location on the southern tip of Lake Michigan made a lumber market possible. Farmers in the fertile but treeless prairies hungered for lumber, for fences and barns. It came from the north end of the lake, where the white pine forests of Michigan and Wisconsin seemed endless. By the time of the Civil War, Chicago had become the largest lumber market in the world.
The scene on the south branch of the Chicago River, you cannot witness anymore. It does not exist in Chicago. It doesn't exist, actually, I think, anywhere in the world. Stack after stack after stack of lumber, all waiting to be shipped on downstate in Illinois, out to Iowa, on to Nebraska or Kansas. A whole district just devoted to stacked lumber.
There are cases where entire prairie families are standing out there in this windswept prairie bog, waiting for their town to arrive. Bar, chapel, houses, it's already made in Chicago. It's stamped on it, made in Chicago, along with the reapers and everything else. They're just standing there with their kids, you know, waiting for that train. Here comes the town.
Within a single generation, Chicago had turned the tall grass prairies, the earthly paradise Joliet and Marquette had admired, into the American Midwest. The city that was transforming America became a hellhole. By the late 1850s, 104 trains a day steamed everywhere, turning Chicago into a smoky and dangerous wasteland.
You know, in New York City, they had to stop at 42nd Street. Vanderbilt, a powerhouse, has to build a train station there. And if he wants to take cars further south, he's got to pull them by mules down to Wall Street. But in Chicago, the train just kept roaring right into town, smoke blowing all over the place. They're killing 2 and 3 people a day there. It's like an Australian said, human life is secondary to making money in Chicago. So they run over a couple of people.
When the Illinois Central wanted tracks along the lakefront, Gurdon Saltonstall Hubbard was one of a few who fought to keep it as a park, forever free. The railroad was forced to build a trestle. The lakeside remained bucolic, but the docking area by the railroad's Riverside Terminal became filled with industrial debris and bloated corpses of horses and cattle. In the 1850s, railroads brought immigrants in overwhelming numbers. Many were Germans who arrived with industrial skills and money. They found jobs as butchers, furniture makers, and metal workers, and became, by 1870, the largest immigrant group. Despite the language barrier, Germans fit more easily into urban life than the impoverished Irish. When the canal was complete, the Irish built the railroads. They also worked as unskilled laborers in factories like McCormick's Reaper Works. They spread out from Bridgeport, but always to slums along the south branch of the Stinking River, where the factories were. The Germans lived north of the river. When the Irish moved to the north side, the Germans moved farther north. A small number of black Americans settled near a vice district on the north side. The city refused to enforce the law to return fugitive slaves. At the close of 1857, Chicago was the largest city in what was then called the Northwest. It had grown from 4,000 to 93,000 in 20 years, the result of unbridled capitalism. A visiting Swedish novelist called Chicago one of the most miserable and ugly cities which I have yet seen in America. A woman writing for Boston's Atlantic Monthly was shocked that it had no public park, no gallery of art, no establishment of music, no social institution whatever except the church. She noticed an appearance of extreme hurry on the streets, but the scarcity of women made them seem, she wrote, forlorn. In this scarcity, another saw opportunity. Potter Palmer had fled a Quaker village in Albany County before finishing school because it was dull. In 1852, he left a dry goods store in Lockport, New York, headed west, and observed the scene on Lake Street. Palmer was impressed by the bustle of mud-splattered farm carts, overburdened prairie freighters, salesmen lugging carpet bags stuffed with samples. Most of all, by the few women shoppers lifting their calico skirts above the mud. He signed a lease. Where there had been few women, Palmer hoped to lure more.
As men and women poured into the city to take advantage of commercial opportunities, Potter Palmer understood that many of those women had not only the time, but also the income to shop, to do what today we think of as recreational consumption. And he created the department store in which that happened.
At a time when women would never enter a restaurant alone, they did shop unescorted. Palmer greeted them at the door, ushered them around the store, remembering their tastes and the names of their pets. He tantalized them with upscale merchandise he purchased in Europe. He was the first city storekeeper to advertise extensively, to run sales or bargain days. He guaranteed a full cash refund, a practice that other merchants were forced to copy if they hoped to compete with the intruder, as Palmer had come to be known. There was one problem. The store on Lake Street was 1 block from the river.
1 block from the river. You could catch the smell of the river. And women, when they shopped at his shop, would put handkerchiefs over their nose.
By 1867, Palmer was Chicago's first merchant prince. He secretly bought all the property along a squalid street which ran away from the river, parallel to the lake. State Street was the trail along which Gurdon Saltonstall Hubbard had driven his hogs from the Wabash Valley. Then he convinced the city council to widen it. Palmer wanted to reorient the city's business district and create a Broadway for Chicago. He built Palmer's Palace, a marble-faced emporium with Corinthian columns, rented it to his new partners, and left retailing for real estate. Many considered the $50,000 a year rent exorbitant. His young partners, Levi Leiter and Marshall Field, did not. Marshall Field would build on Palmer's methods to become Chicago's commercial giant, a power that even the elite, and especially immigrant workers, would cross at their peril. For much of the 19th century, Americans knew where their bacon came from. They saw the pigs in local pastures, knew the farmer who fed them, and the butcher who killed them. It was a familiar world, rooted in nature.